that me, Caitlin? Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight from wherever you may reside. And my name is David Gregg, and for those of you who I haven't met before, I'm the CEO of GMHBA. Before we kick off this evening, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we're all joining this evening. Personally, I'm joining from the lands of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to particularly acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us on our webinar today, and I'm glad that you're here. Thank you again all for joining us this evening to hear from Dr. Michael Carr-Gregg about the psychology of change and transitioning to a COVID normal world. GMHBA is absolutely committed to providing our members and community with continued support throughout the ongoing pandemic. So to date, for example, we've provided a $15.4 million support package to members, which included a 6-month premium increase deferral and access to telehealth benefits. We've expanded our care coordination service to ensure our most vulnerable members were supported through ongoing phone contact and through the delivery of various care packages. We've partnered with Keyser to give members access to physiotherapist-designed wellbeing programs without out-of-pocket costs, and we'll continue to support members in whichever way we can throughout this period. And as we transition to something more akin to what I hope will be a normal environment, or as some people are calling it, COVID normal, and what I hope and what certainly looks to be in the near future. And so, in the spirit of this commitment, first of all, well done in making it this far through the pandemic. And I really hope that tonight you find this webinar helpful and insightful and empowering. As we look ahead to the next few months, I know most of us will be feeling excitement and perhaps a little bit of trepidation about the changes in the freedoms that we'll gradually be able to enjoy and what a COVID normal life might look like for us in the near future. The best thing we can do to manage this change is to be as proactive in equipping ourselves with the tools, information and strategies that can help us get through this next period. And so I'm delighted that this evening, to help us navigate this change, I'm really proud on behalf of GMHBA to introduce Dr. Michael Carr-Gregg. Dr. Michael Carr-Gregg is one of Australia's highest profile child and adolescent psychologists. He's a patron of Read the Play. He's authored many books and for the last 14 years has been the parenting expert who you may have seen on Sunrise on Channel 7, and also you may have seen him on The Morning Show or perhaps heard him on Neil Mitchell on 3AW. So Michael joins us today to discuss the upcoming transitions and how we might best equip ourselves to navigate the change ahead. So I'm really grateful to Michael for spending time with us this evening, and I hope you enjoy the session. Welcome, Michael. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. And I am absolutely delighted to be here. I'm just going to very quickly do the magic required to make this screen do exactly what it's supposed to do. There we go. And I have to say to you, thank you. Whoops. Thank you so much for, I hope you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, good. Splendid. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the GMHBA family. And I've really enjoyed my involvement so far. And I'm hoping that you will get something out of today. Special thanks to Molly Jones for all her hard work. Really appreciate her help. So I am a psychologist. The people at Channel 7 tell me that they've been using me all these years because I'm quite a PhD that can speak in sound bites. Don't know if that's a compliment, but that's what they said. I've been Neil Mitchell's psychologist for quite some time. I've written about 17 books now, and I've managed to raise 2 children, neither of whom have got into great trouble yet. And I'm part owner of a company called School TV. So tonight we're going to talk about transitions, and I just find them something that we don't really talk very much about. And I want you to begin the webinar with a question, and that is, how many of us have actually essentially faced a major life transition for which you felt comfortably prepared. And I'm thinking about things like marriage, parenting, a new job, a major health crisis, or the death of a loved one. I don't think there are many people who, confronted with a major life transition, actually ended up by saying, nailed it. After it was over, very few people go, did well. Because the truth is that very few people are prepared for major life transitions. The truth is that most of us white knuckle our way through transitions just to survive. And that's a shame, because transitions can be profound moments of transformation. And preparing for transitions is something that psychologists can teach about and prepare you for, which is what tonight is about. So the one key message that I wish you to take on board for today is that inside the pain of every single transition is actually an invitation to grow. And transitions, you will discover, are much easier when you can be honest with yourself and you can use the community around you. So really tonight's message, courtesy of GMHBA, is not to squander your transitions. And I think it's really, really important. I think the question that everybody's asking themselves at the moment, after 77 days of lockdown, certainly in Melbourne, and that was the last one, was, were these lockdowns actually worth it? Does the fact that Melbourne hold the world record and made everyone go through the transitions that they made them go through, was it in fact worthwhile? Has the world's longest lockdown saved us from a great calamity? Has it saved us from our hospitals being completely overrun? Has it saved us from the scenes of makeshift morgues being erected in Burke Street? Or has the cost to destroyed livelihoods, devastated communities, personal freedoms, and mental health been simply too great? Well, it's an interesting question, and I think it's a question that history will decide. From my point of view, as an observer of what's going on for a lot of young people and old people and middle-aged people going through transition, I'm noticing that a lot of the parents that I'm seeing are feeling really deflated coming out of lockdown. And I wanted to explain why. The first thing is a concept which you might not have ever heard of, but it's called surge capacity. It's a collection of responses, mental and physical, which are really quite useful. Human beings for centuries have drawn on surge capacity in order to get through acutely stressful situations like the ones we've just been through. For many people right now, it seems to me that their brains and their bodies are simply exhausted. And in part, that's because many of them have been relying on surge capacity, which is great in the moment, but it only keeps us going for so long. Eventually, it depletes. And I think we're pretty much depleted. Everybody needs a break to recharge. So I think a lot of people very much want to press play and, just resume life as normal. But our minds and our bodies are still tending a little bit towards pause for a nice anxiety-reduced rest. I think that is understandable. What were the mental health impacts of this particular transition? Well, as a child and adolescent psychologist, I've been acutely aware of the fact that this impact was disproportionately felt by young people. There's no question that the prevalence of anxiety, depression, eating disorders, self-harm, and suicidal ideation were absolutely felt by the young people. How do we know? Well, there's some really simple markers. You don't need massive research for this. The presentations to accident and emergency are generally carefully triaged and recorded. And we know that compared to 2019, when we didn't have COVID, to 2020 and 2021, when we did, the presentations to accident and emergency for these conditions have gone up anywhere between 40 to 60%, depending on which accident and emergency you're talking about. The only good thing that I can say about the mental health impacts is that the suicide rate actually fell in the pandemic. Now, a lot of people are probably thinking, well, how did that happen? Well, my spin on this is that human beings are in fact social animals. We cope with terrible things by huddling in social groups, and we support one another, which is good. During wars, it is a historical fact that suicide rates go down. It's almost as if society pulls together, united against a common enemy, and acts together. So I think COVID was a big crisis that affected the whole community, and ironically, in some areas, created a great sense of solidarity, which ironically has protected us against mental health. I also think that the advent of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, those programs protected families from poverty, which is a very significant risk factor for mental health problems. So in many respects, we managed to just sort of get through in time. So we've got one clear set of indicators, which was presentations to accident emergency. The other was calls to helplines, which absolutely went up. You can see the top headline there, Victorian teenage suicide threats jump 184%. That's actually quite an interesting phenomenon. So if you ring, for example, Kids Helpline, there are some calls which are so serious that the operator then presses a button and we actually see an ambulance and a police person called to the site of where that phone call is coming from. And the number of calls that got that response did increase 184%. So you have two really clear indicators: accident emergency admissions and the telephone helplines. On top of that, we had GPs, and GPs reported a really significant increase in numbers of children, young people, and families that were experiencing issues for the very first time. They were coming forward not having had a background of stress or mental health experience in the past, and others just had an exacerbation or a reactivation of problems they had in the past. So the other interesting fact that we got from the research was that while the rates did increase over time, they were higher in those areas that had experienced the longest lockdowns, suggesting that they are in part at least related to the impact of those restrictions on young people. Stepping back from young people and looking at human beings generally, I really was impressed with the words of Dr. Murray White, who is the New South Wales chief psychiatrist. And he observed that this was probably the most sustained and serious stress that many of us were going to face in our lifetime. And if you think about it, the school closures coupled with the cancelled community sport, the closing of playgrounds and skate parks and basketball courts and all recreational facilities, essentially the most stringent lockdown rules anywhere, simply prevented social interaction amongst a lot of us. And that did give rise to widespread isolation, a lot of fear, and of course, ultimately some devastating mental health issues for our young people. So go back to the idea of transitions. Many of us don't like to have to look at the question, now what? Reason for that is when it comes to the future, you just can't wing it. Transitions, as I said earlier, are much easier with self-honesty and drawing on the community. I don't think anybody should go through transitions alone. And the question that a lot of people are asking is, who loves me enough to tell me the truth, to challenge my thinking? I've always divided our friends into two categories: coffee friends who will talk about you, and caring friends who will fight with you, stand with you, and for you. And I think at this time of transition, we really need a lot of those caring friends. So what's been happening to the psychology of people facing this particular transition? Well, I think the two most common emotions after lockdown are fear and anxiety. And when we're facing a crisis of any sort, fear and anxiety are almost inevitable. They are normal, natural responses to challenging situations infused with so much danger and uncertainty. And what are people worried about now? I think some people are still struggling with their mental health, particularly after the restrictions are partially lifted. Frankly, people faced with this transition are scared. They're scared about what life is going to look like post-lockdown. And I think it's tricky starting to do those things that we've been told for so long that are really dangerous. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty. Will life be as good? What might go wrong? What might hurt me? And what might I be deprived of around the corner? What is going to happen next? I think a really useful way to understand how most people face the unknown is to think of us as basically hating uncertainty. And what happens is that our mind can tell us all kind of scary stories when we don't know the facts. It's almost like your mind becomes a fortune teller that always predicts the worst. We fill in the gap of knowledge with lots of catastrophic narratives or what if stories. My view has always been, if these stories make you feel even worse, then they're not helpful for a transition. And it's not helpful to reread them or add new chapters. So is there an alternative? You bet there's an alternative. So here's the number one message for tonight around transitions. And that is, instead of getting caught up in these catastrophic narratives, what we can do instead is name them, notice them, and diffuse them. I think this is one of the great pieces of knowledge that comes from psychology in the last 50 years, that we essentially have the capacity to distance ourselves from our thoughts. The two most important psychological strategies to share with your families as we come out of lockdown and deal with this transition is that you are not your thoughts. Rather, you can be the observer of your thoughts. The analogy that I use is to imagine that you're sitting at a psychological bus stop and a bus rocks up, and on the side of that bus is a sign that says the economy is stuffed and businesses will never recover. Now, of course, you have a choice. You can get on that bus, you can talk to the driver, you can talk to the passengers, you can zip off on your misery journey to this destination of doom, gloom, and despondency. Alternatively, you can choose which bus to get on. And you remain seated, there'll be another bus that comes along with a much more uplifting and positive message. More and more people are getting vaccinated, lockdowns will become less necessary. So here's the most empowering message of dealing with transitions. Yes, your mind will fill in the gap, but you're not obliged to buy into those stories. The second thing I recommend people do when they're faced with the transition is to focus on the things that they can control. It's a really simple exercise. And that is, I get people to draw a circle. I get them to brainstorm all the things in their life that they feel they do have control over, and then brainstorm all the things in their life that they don't. And you might get a circle that looks a little bit like this. So obviously you have control over how much sleep you get, whether you exercise, what you eat, and your attitudes, and whether you practice kindness and grace. But you actually don't have any control over things like how long this will last, whether other people get a vaccination, if others basically play the game, other people's motives. So what's the point of this circle of control? It's a really important message for transition. And that is that you will often find in life that sometimes things are just so heavy that it's best to let them go, that you cannot spend the time focusing on them. So why do I think this transition has been so hard for a lot of people? I think it's the first time that our generation has been asked to sacrifice our individual freedoms for the greater good. I think that it's also the cumulative effect of not one, but in Melbourne, 6 lockdowns. I think people have lost their rhythm and structure. And as that old song goes, you never know what you've got till it's gone. Boy, it went. I think people got sick of the monotony of their lives. They got very lonely because they couldn't go out. And I think that they lost a lot of important experiences. In contrast to my father's generation and my mother's generation that were asked to make lots of sacrifices during World War II, and their parents in World War I, we weren't prepared for this. In many respects, we were not resilient in the same way that they were resilient. And the result is that many of us have ended up languishing. I don't know if you know this term. It's the sense of stagnation, of muddling through your day, the void between depression and flourishing, the absence of well-being. And be clear, if you're languishing, it doesn't mean you have a mental illness. It just means you're not functioning at full capacity. And as we transition, I'm meeting a lot of young people, a lot of parents who are languishing. What are the signs that you're languishing? Well, you don't have very much motivation. Your ability to focus is disrupted. The likelihood that you'll cut back on work and academics is tripled. There's a dulling of delight, a dwindling of desire. We can easily slip into solitude and withdraw. We become almost indifferent to our indifference. This is not a good sign. But as the great man, Dr. Phil, once said, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. So we have to be honest with ourselves. Are we languishing? Have we developed a mental health problem? Are we doing anything about it? We know from the statistics that before lockdown, 1 in 5 Australians had a mental illness. What is a mental illness? Thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that impact on our functioning. And the key is duration and severity. So under that definition, we know 1 in 5 Australians have a mental illness, but we also know that only 35% actually seek help, which is, of course, a disaster. And that was before COVID. The research will be really interesting to see whether or not COVID has had a silver lining in that it has brought mental health issues to the fore. But all of that is really not the point. The point is, what can I say to you will help you through transitions? And I want to give you an analogy. It's called the eggs in the basket paradigm. And what it says is that every single day we are given 30 eggs. Each egg represents a unit of your psychological energy. And it's up to you to decide how you distribute these eggs. You've got a choice of putting them in yourself, in your family, however you choose to define it, or into work. Each day, we actually make conscious decisions about how we're going to distribute these psychological eggs. It's really up to you to decide in the face of transition where you put your energy. Is it going to be yourself, your family, or your work? The challenge is, of course, that we all have a finite number of eggs to distribute. And I believe, that you need to think carefully about, when you're faced with a transition, how you choose to allocate your eggs. And this is not to be confused with time. This is psychological energy. So what do we know from people working in the big wide world about the way they're currently distributing their eggs? Most of the people, if they're honest, will tell you that they have 5 in their own, 10 in their family, and 15 in their work. This, in my view, is a one-way ticket to heart attack, stroke, cancer, and a complete collapse of your immune system. I think what the research is telling us is that if you really want to manage a transition, if you want good psychological health during transition, then your distribution should in fact be 15 eggs in your own basket. And if you put 15 eggs in your own basket, then the 10 that you put into however you define your family will be double yolkers, and the 5 that you put into work will be solid gold. So it's the quality of the eggs that ultimately matter. So the question is, how can you put 15 eggs in your own basket? What are the building blocks of well-being in a transition? Well, a lot of this is from the University of the Bleeding Obvious, and that is, clearly you spend a third of your entire life doing one thing, and that's sleeping. Yep, if you live to 92, you'll have spent about 30 years of your life fast asleep. And we know sleep is one of the most important ways for you to put eggs in your own basket. Michael Mosley wrote a book which came out just around the first lockdown, and it was called Fast Asleep. And he talked about how important it is for us to recognize that about 50 to 70% of adults don't actually get enough sleep. There are significant dangers associated with sleep deprivation. And you kind of think, how complicated could it be? And the answer is very. It's arguably the most important thing that your brain ever does. And while I don't have a degree in circadian medicine, I can tell you that those who do have very, very clear advice. And that is, you need to go to bed and wake up at the same time. You need to dim the lights in your environment half an hour before you go to bed. You need to sleep in a bed which is cool, dark, and quiet. You need to minimize anxiety, avoid stimulants, particularly caffeine, and reduce your blue light exposure. It's not that complicated, but the logic is clear. If you invest in your sleep, you will be psychologically much better off. We now know that during good night's sleep, you replenish your supplies of serotonin, the master molecule of mood. Don't know if you've noticed that we get enough sleep, you wake up grumpy and irritable, and that's because you don't have enough serotonin zipping around your brain. The other building block of well-being is exercise. And it's amazing, you know, millions of years, our brains thrived under constant motion. Did you know we walked, according to the social anthropologists, 19.3 kilometers a day? Otherwise, we became someone's lunch. Now, of course, we have cars, couches, and cubicles, which have basically replaced walking. To give you an idea, a little snapshot of how important exercise actually is, let me share with you an amazing study done in 2004. So I'm 17 years old. It was done by a guy called Harada. And what he did is he took 27-year-old couch potatoes and he basically made them do an exercise program. But every single day of the exercise program, he actually measured aspects of their brain function, things like reaction time, recall. And what he found, as you can see, is an exponential increase in brain function with exercise. So where there was none, they replaced it with some, and you can see the result. The kind of main thing they did is after 12 weeks, they stopped them from exercise, but continued to measure their brains, and you can see what happened. So we know that exercise is crucial. We know that if you have depression or anxiety, one of the first things any good psychologist or GP will do is get you on an exercise program, because we know that that will oxygenate the brain, release endorphins. It actually releases dopamine, which can keep you task focused, as well as the serotonin. So we've got sleep and we've got diet. How hard can that, sleep and exercise. The third thing is diet. And most of you coming from Geelong will be aware of the Food Mood Centre and the amazing work that's been done by Professor Felice Jacka over the years. I first saw her article in 2010 in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and I've been a fan ever since. And we now know that if you want to stay psychologically and physically well, then you got to eat good stuff. I gave a talk early today at about 9 o'clock to a bunch of kids in an Islamic school in the middle of Melbourne. And we talked about diet. We talked about the things that were good to eat and bad to eat. And the questions they asked were fascinating. And yes, fast food in moderation is okay. But if you eat it every day, you've got high fat, high sugar, high processed food. It's not good for you physically, but more importantly, it's not good for you mentally. So what's a good diet? Well, there's no single almighty brain food that can help you through transitions. But we do know that if you eat this type of food, you're going to be much better off than if you eat nothing but junk food. That said, we know certain foods in the overall scheme of things are particularly good in terms of your brain function. So not hard to eat blueberries. It's not hard, I don't think, for most people to eat eggs and avocado or tuna or salmon. So we know these things are associated with a better mood state. So what else can we do to make transitions to the COVID normal better? Well, I think the antidote to languishing is, in fact, to seek out a state of flow. What is a flow state? Invented by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote a book called Flow. He observed that there are times in our life when we become so absorbed in something, like a really good book or movie, that time seems to pass. We lose our sense of self and even place. And that's awesome, because what we know is that faced with a transition and all the stress related to transitions, if we can be honest with ourselves, if we can remind ourselves that we're not alone, be compassionate to ourselves, and seek out flow states, we'll be much better off. And that means taking small incremental steps towards flow. It also means digitally detoxing a little bit, because a lot of us have spent a lot of time on screens, to make contact with our peers. Do you know Marty Seligman, the great famous father of positive psychology, was asked once, what's the greatest predictor of well-being in human beings? And he said, it's not being good looking. It's not essentially having more good things happen to you than bad. It's not about being wealthy. He said it's about having a rich repertoire of friends. And I think that's true. The other thing that I think makes a big difference when we're faced with a major transition is what we tell ourselves. Now, Seligman and I both believe that social networks are our biggest assets, and that particularly as far as our children are concerned, academic achievement is important, but it's not as important as helping ourselves and our family to remain emotionally connected with peers, and engage with their social networks, particularly while we finish the vaccination job. And we hear today the booster shots as well. So what's a healthy internal narrative? I think it's up to us to set our own emotional tone. Be alert, not alarmed. Yep, this has been very challenging. But you know what? If you can't change something, change the way you think about it. How am I changing the way I think about it? I'm reminding myself all the time that while the lockdowns were hard, we did protect public health while the vaccines were rolled out. And you can't have a well-functioning economy when people are dying by their thousands in nursing homes and in our ICUs. So I think this is a good internal narrative when faced with a transition, along with our role as caregivers, which is to be purveyors of hope. I looked at the vaccination tracker in the Age today, and I saw, wow, 34 million doses, pretty good. The vaccination rates are clearly increasing. There is a roadmap for lessening restrictions. A back of the envelope estimate is that 126,000 lives were saved. And on top of that, the most vulnerable, if you look at the diagram on the left, our elderly, are in fact the most protected, which is as it should be. I saw Nick Coatesworth being quoted in the paper this morning saying we will be the world leader or close to it in vaccination rates. And I thought, well, that's good. So I'm talking about optimism. And I think we have to have an optimistic mindset when faced with transitions of this magnitude. How do you operationalize that? Well, every time I see a piece of good news in the paper, I take a screenshot and I send it to the kids. Why? Because I think it's really important that we celebrate the good news. The Prime Minister said a couple of weeks ago that it's always darkest before the dawn. I think it is. But now we've got a little bit of a dawn. And trust me, the best view comes after the hardest climb. And boy, we have had a hard climb. So what else can you do faced with these difficult transitions? I think the importance of ritual can never be underestimated. Family rituals at this time are more important than ever. You see, they're powerful organizers of family life that offer a sense of usness, of stability, especially when we're faced with times of disruption, stress, and the sort of transitions that we're going through. These family rituals give children a sense of meaning, belonging, purpose, and validation. I think they promote a sense of identity in the young people, which will later serve as the basis for adult development. So what's your tradition? Many families didn't have any, but some developed them during lockdown. I've got some families that had board game Tuesday, pizza night Wednesday, movie night Thursdays. And I think these traditions, this regularity, is very important to young people. So what else do I want you to do as a caregiver faced with this transition? I think it's really important that you keep the lines of communication open. My advice is that you ask the members of your family how they feel. And most importantly, let them know that it's okay to feel whatever they want to feel. So many of the kids that I talk to are really scared. They're worried, they're angry, they're sad. I would use the phrase, hey, help me understand what's going on for you. And then once you've heard, rephrase it back to them. So what you're saying is ... and then help them reframe their worries and put them in a context using some of the techniques that I've talked about earlier. I think we should answer all of their questions honestly. A really important principle around transitions is talking things through can help them feel much calmer. In the same way that we say, calm your mind, calm your breath, calm your mind. similarly, talking things through can help people feel a lot more at ease. I think we need to take action. We need to encourage our sons and daughters to re-embrace the world, to come out of their rooms, to exercise, to play sport, walk the dog, watch a film, read, cook, draw, or write. Just participate once again. For some, it's going to be slow, but we need to be the wind beneath their wings. We need to keep as many regular routines going as possible to help them feel secure, especially the sleep-wake cycles, meal times and school times. And I think that includes lunch and recess. Above all, we need to manage our own state of mind. We need to be on the lookout for all the signs and symptoms of trouble. And I'll talk about them in a second. I also think schools should be doing a lot to educate parents. I think that we should let students go off curriculum and just talk about whatever they want. I think we should help them build connections, social connections. I think we should look to the arts to help young people express themselves. And I think we should encourage mindfulness, pressing the pause button on the DVD of life, just to center ourselves from time to time. And of course, look to ritual, very important. So my my big tips for coming out of lockdown and managing this transition is to adjust your expectations, to take it step by step. Don't rush it. Focus and act on what you can control. Use the strategies that I've talked about, as long as you're comfortable with them. Seek help early if there's signs of problems, and just keep the conversation going. We need to talk. So the 7 big wellbeing tips for me as an adult right now is to make sure that I address my own basic needs, my needs for sleep, diet, exercise, and connectivity. I need to give my family something great to imitate. I need to look for the positives in each day. I need to focus on the things that I can control. I also need to de-escalate my nervous system. Now, I'm not a yoga or meditation person, but I do practice mindfulness. And I think we need to cultivate compassion for those around us. Very important. And I think we need to rekindle connections with other people. It was Winston Churchill who said, when you're going through hell, keep going. I think that is great advice. And I hope that you found something of today useful. Warm thanks to GEM HBA for putting it on. And I'll hand back to Amanda.
Thanks, Michael. That was excellent. We've got a number of questions already lined up, so I'll facilitate this part of the session for you. Do you have any suggestions on how to not get sucked into the trap of only talking about COVID with friends, family, and colleagues? That's an interesting one.
It's a great question because, of course, people do like to ruminate. And I think that this is an expression of their anxiety, which I understand. And I think I said in the talk that the 2 most common kind of responses to a transition is anxiety and fear. So the way in which I would deal with that is I would basically say, yep, understandable that you'd feel that way, but let's reframe it. Let's look at the positives. And there is something positive about all of us having gone through this. A lot of people are focused much more, for example, on their exercise. There are new opportunities which weren't present before. There are, ironically, more jobs available now than ever before. So I think we can seek out the positives and get people to reframe it, but certainly acknowledge their feelings of anxiety. I think we should name it, but then we should try and reframe it, recontextualize it. So the 2 principles that I use is if you can't change something, change the way you think about it, and see life as it is, but focus on the good bits.
Great advice. In a similar vein, Molly Jones has a question for you. As you say, you can't control other people's behaviour or the extent to which they follow rules, but do you have any advice for gently steering difficult, combative or ruminative conversations in a more positive direction?
Yeah, a really good example of that is the people who are very hesitant to get a vaccination, and they can be quite belligerent and they can be quite kind of dogmatic. And what I do is I don't mock them for their views. What I do instead is I talk to them about where they've got their information from. I've invited them to go and talk to their GP, and I've talked to them quite quietly about what the implications of not being vaccinated would mean. Things like them not being able to take a plane flight or potentially hop on a train or a bus, not being able to go into a shopping centre or attend sporting events. So to me, not being belligerent back is a real good start, and having a calm, tactful conversation which kind of steers them towards, isn't it great that? My very strong recollection of my father was, and he was a person who lived through the Blitz in London, which was on the 7th of September 1940, where for 57 days in a row, the Luftwaffe bombed London. 1 million homes were destroyed. 40,000 people died. It was awful. And I often asked him, well, how did you cope? And he said, there were signs up everywhere. Keep calm and carry on. And I think that it's drawing on our past ancestors that can be useful. They got through it. They were the great generation. This is an opportunity for us to do the same thing.
Excellent. Another similar question. Although many people are excited about coming out of lockdown, the demand on healthcare workers will increase. What tips do you have to keep positive during these trying times, particularly while friends are excited?
Yeah, look, it's again a matter of us keeping perspective. If we look after ourselves, if we do the things that I've suggested, if we have the kind of mindset that I've suggested, I think we'll get through this really well. And there's nothing like you giving people something to imitate, particularly your children and family and friends. So I want people to say, wow, well, he sort of kept his head while everybody else was kind of running around with doom, gloom and despondency. And I've been really consistent. I think I've given about 238 webinars since this all started. My message hasn't changed. Now, happily, we've got light at the end of the tunnel. But I think the principles of, if you can't change it, change the way you think about it, and focusing on the good bits and seeing life as it is, that will sustain us.
Excellent. Another good question that's come up is around dealing with really young kids. So this particular participant's asking, my 4-year-old had a good understanding of the rules around the germs. What's a good way to frame the information now that the rules are changing, but the germs haven't gone away 100%?
Great question. So I use the analogy with little kids of our immune system being like an army. And what happened was that normally our personal army is really good at fighting off invaders like infections and bacteria. But sometimes the enemy was really quick. And the great news is that we've got this thing called a vaccine. The vaccine teaches our soldiers how to fight the invaders and not let them in. And it doesn't matter how fast they are, because we've taught our soldiers how to fight, they'll win. So I now talk about that at that level to young children. And it's something they can really relate to. So that was then, this is now, how awesome. One of the things I was going to say, that Dad always used to say was, when there's a crisis, look to the helpers. And I would be refocusing everybody's attention on how incredible nurses, doctors, health administrators and the hospital staff have been in getting us through this, and focusing on the fact that while many people predicted that our healthcare system would collapse, it didn't. Yep, got stretched, but it's still going. And in fact, the hospitalisation predictions are really out of whack with what we're currently seeing, which is good news.
Certainly is. I think we've got time for one more question. I think you've touched on this a little bit around the concept of languishing, and how with young children, many people have been in survival mode, and how do you get out of that type of thinking?
Well, I think it's slowly and gradually is the answer. We just need to take baby steps. And it's amazing, the overseas research shows that it can take up to 6 months to adapt, which is good news, but the vast majority of people are adapting. The little ones in particular, a lot of people are worried about them. They were worried about whether mask wearing would affect their social emotional development. Research shows no, it didn't. The children were able to adapt, which is awesome. Probably my little fear I have is, particularly for the 2 to 3 year olds, they've actually spent 2 years of their life in some form of lockdown and restrictions. And for some, they had the kind of undivided attention of one adult. And then now we're transitioning them to preschool. I was worried that we'd see a kind of avalanche of sort of separation anxiety. But so far, fingers crossed, they seem to have managed. I think preschools have done an amazing job in helping kids transition. So a lot of the doom, gloom and despondency predictions have been wrong, both physically and psychologically. And I think we can take a lot out of that.
Excellent. And one final question, and I think this is the $1 million question. How can I encourage disengaged family members to take your advice?
Well, I think that we need to put a couple of key messages on high rotation. So without giving them lectures, I think we just need to say similar things every time we get the opportunity. And I think using teachable moments, pointing out really positive news stories on TV, particularly in newspapers, and letting people know, doing the screenshot texting thing that I've been doing to get buoys people's spirits. And what I want is for the kids, when they get older, to think back to 2021 and go, what did Dad do? Oh, that's right. He had a consistent narrative of, let's be optimistic, we're alert but not alarmed. He never catastrophized. He never panicked. He basically kept our spirits up. And I think that's our job.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. So informative and so interesting, and huge abundance of really useful strategies for all of us to take away. I'll now just hand back to our CEO of GMHBA, David Gregg, to make some concluding comments. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Amanda. Michael, on behalf of GMHBA and our community, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us this evening. I've really enjoyed the way you've demystified for us the sometimes overwhelming task of adapting to change during COVID. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. I really enjoyed the simple messages about observing, naming and diffusing negative thoughts, focusing on what we can control, and making sure, as we often do, remember to look after ourselves, because often we put ourselves last and we spend so much of our energy, so many of our eggs, as you put it, looking after our work and our friends and our family and putting ourselves last. So it was a timely reminder to look after ourselves through sleep, exercise, diet, and self-care. So thank you so much for sharing that wisdom. And To our GMHBA community, thank you for joining us this evening and for coming together. I hope there was some helpful tidbits in there for you and things that can help you keep moving forward. Really glad to have been able to provide this opportunity for us all to come together, and stay well, look after yourselves, look after the people you care about, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks everyone for joining.